My name is Claire. I'm 29 years old, and I work as a 911 emergency dispatcher for Riverside County. 3 weeks ago, I drove across town on a Saturday evening to attend my half-sister's 5th wedding anniversary party. I wore a simple navy dress I had owned for 2 years. Nothing fancy, nothing that would draw attention. I told myself that was fine. I was used to not drawing attention. The party was already in full swing when I arrived. The driveway was lined with cars I couldn't name, sleek and spotless and quietly expensive. String lights wrapped around the oak trees in the front yard, and through the large front windows I could see well-dressed guests moving through my half-sister's living room, glasses in hand, laughing at things I hadn't heard yet. I stood at the front door for just a moment before ringing the bell. My half-sister opened it herself. She was wearing a red dress and the particular smile she used for social events, the one that was calibrated perfectly for the audience in front of her. She looked beautiful. She almost always looked beautiful at things like this. It was a skill she had spent years practicing and had long since perfected. "You made it," she said brightly. "I made it," I said. I handed her the bottle of wine I had brought. She glanced at the label for exactly 1 second, passed it to someone nearby without looking at who that person was, and stepped aside to let me in. The inside of the house was warm and impeccably arranged. My half-sister and her husband had bought this place 3 years ago, and she had spent those 3 years turning it into something that looked like it belonged in a design catalog. High ceilings, white walls, artwork she had carefully researched, furniture that probably cost more than my car. She had always had a talent for building environments that made other people feel slightly inadequate just by standing inside them. I found a quiet spot near the kitchen entrance, got a glass of sparkling water, and stood there watching the room for a while. I recognized a few faces scattered through the crowd. Some relatives from my mother's side. A few of my half-sister's friends whose names blurred together in my memory. And then there were people I had never seen before, polished guests in polished clothes, the kind my half-sister always seemed to accumulate at events like this. Real estate people, business people, people who would describe themselves as well-connected and mean it as a simple statement of fact. My half-sister's husband found me first. He was a decent man, quieter than she was, and I had always suspected he was sometimes quietly embarrassed by her. He shook my hand and asked how work was going. I told him fine. He nodded and said that was good. It was the kind of small talk that neither of us particularly enjoyed, but both of us knew how to complete. My mother appeared shortly after that. She squeezed my arm and said I looked pretty, and I told her she did too, and both of those things were genuinely true. My mother had always been the kind of woman who loved everyone in her life loudly and without conditions. She had never fully understood why things between my half-sister and me were the way they were. She wanted things to be simple, and because she wanted it badly enough, she had convinced herself a long time ago that they were. I had grown up knowing that my half-sister and I were different in ways that went deeper than personality. Our father had come to my mother later in life, after 2 other families had already come and gone. My half-sister was the daughter from his second marriage, and when everyone eventually settled under the same roof, we became a blended family on paper. In practice, we were 2 girls who happened to share a house, a last name, and a bathroom that was too small for both of us. My half-sister had always had more. More attention, more praise, more space at the center of every room she walked into. She moved through the world with the confidence of someone who had never seriously been told no, and that confidence had only grown as she got older. She had married well, by her own definition. She had the house, the social calendar, the look. She had become the person she had always intended to become. I had gone a different direction. After high school, I spent a year not being sure what I wanted. I took a part-time job at a call center to pay for things while I figured it out. Somewhere in that time, I applied for a position with the county emergency services. Half out of curiosity and half because the job listing used the word meaningful 3 times in the first paragraph, and I was young enough to find that persuasive. I passed the written exams. I passed the training simulations. I passed the certification requirements. And then I sat down at a dispatch console for the first time and discovered, with some surprise, that I was genuinely built for it. Most people don't think about what dispatching actually is. When they call 911, Their minds go immediately to the responders. The paramedics who show up with their bags. The firefighters who break through doors. The police officers with their lights going. Nobody pictures the person sitting in a room full of monitors and headsets 3 miles away, managing multiple calls at once. Routing help through a grid of streets to people who are running out of time. Nobody thinks about the voice on the other end as anything beyond a transfer point. I had been doing it for 6 years by the time I went to that party. In 6 years, I had talked people through things I don't talk about at family gatherings. I had walked strangers through CPR in their own living rooms. I had stayed on the line with children who were hiding in closets while sounds came from other parts of their houses. I had guided people through the worst minutes of their lives, from a chair, in a building on a street most people in the county had never driven down. And when my shift ended, I drove home and made dinner, and went to sleep and came back the next day and did it again. I never talked about it much. It felt strange to talk about it, like carrying someone else's story out of the room where it happened and turning it into a thing you say at a party. My half-sister had never asked about any of it. The evening moved through the standard rhythms of a well-organized social event. Food circulated on small plates. Clusters of guests shifted and reformed. The conversation was the kind that sounded significant without necessarily saying much. My half-sister moved through the room with practiced ease, guiding conversations, steering introductions, making sure that everyone felt both welcome and slightly impressed. I kept mostly to the edges. I refilled my sparkling water once. I had a brief conversation with an older woman about a garden she was trying to start in her backyard. I checked my phone twice out of habit and reminded myself that I wasn't on call that night. Around 8 o'clock, my half-sister tapped her glass with a spoon. The sound spread across the room, and the conversations gradually dropped. She was standing in the center of the living room, the chandelier above her doing everything a chandelier is designed to do in that situation. I just want to say, she started, and her voice carried effortlessly. How grateful we both are to have everyone here tonight. 5 years. She turned and looked at her husband, and the smile was real that time. 5 years, and this man still thinks it was a good idea. The room laughed warmly. Before dinner really gets going, she continued, I want to take a minute to introduce some of the people here who might not know each other. She began moving around the room with her eyes, pointing out guests and attaching accomplishments to them the way a skilled host does. A couple who had just finished building a second home on the coast. A business partner of her husband's who had recently expanded into 3 new markets. A woman who had recently joined the board of a regional children's foundation. Then her gaze found me near the kitchen entrance. And over there, she said, gesturing toward me, is my half-sister. She drove all the way across town tonight. She paused for just a beat, the way someone pauses when they want the room to be paying attention before the punchline. She answers phone calls for a living. A few people smiled. Someone near the back made a quiet, good-natured sound. I kept my face still. I took a slow breath through my nose. I had known my half-sister for my entire conscious life, and I knew exactly what had just happened. It wasn't a joke about a job. It was a measurement. A quiet, efficient, socially acceptable way of establishing the hierarchy in the room before dinner, using me as the low end of the scale. I didn't respond. I had stopped arguing with moments like that a long time ago. Arguing with her only made things louder and never made things better. The introductions moved on. Someone started talking about a restaurant opening nearby. My half-sister drifted back into the flow of the room like water returning to level. I looked down at my glass. That was when I noticed the man in the dark suit. He was standing roughly 15 feet away, near one of the tall bookshelves my half-sister had filled with objects she had never opened. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, with gray at his temples and a face that carried a certain kind of weight, the kind of weight that comes from going through something serious and continuing anyway. He had been in a conversation when my half-sister made her introductions. But he wasn't in that conversation anymore. He was looking at me, not the way people glance at someone new in a room. He was looking at me the way a person looks when something is pushing up through their memory and they can't quite get hold of it yet. There was a focus to it that felt different from casual attention. Deliberate. Like he was searching for something specific. I looked at the painting on the far wall and pretended to study it. A minute later, he was still doing it. The person beside him said something, and he answered without fully redirecting his attention. His eyes drifted back. He rubbed the side of his jaw slowly, working through something privately. After a few more minutes, he excused himself from his conversation and drifted toward the refreshment table, which happened to put him about 6 feet closer to where I was standing. He picked up a glass, set it down, picked it up again. He wasn't really interested in the glass. My half-sister came over at some point with a couple I vaguely recognized from a previous event. She started talking about a trip she and her husband were planning for the spring a month in Southern Europe, itineraries still being finalized, so many decisions to make. I nodded when it seemed appropriate. "You're not in real estate, are you?" she said suddenly, turning to me mid-conversation. "No," I said. "Right." She smiled at the couple. "She works for the county. Emergency services." She delivered the word county the way some people deliver the word local, with a particular softness that isn't quite pity but lives close to it. The couple nodded politely and moved the topic somewhere else. From the corner of my eye, I could see the man in the dark suit had put his glass down again. He wasn't pretending to look at anything else anymore. He was watching me with a kind of focused patience, like someone waiting for the last piece of something to drop into place. Then he began walking slowly across the room toward me. He stopped a few feet away and waited quietly for a break in my half-sister's conversation. She noticed him and turned. "I'm so sorry to interrupt," he said, and his voice was calm and unhurried. I couldn't help overhearing. "Did you say she works for County Emergency Services?" My half-sister tilted her head slightly. "She's a 911 dispatcher. Answers the calls." She said it lightly. He looked at me directly. "What's your name?" "Claire," I said. He was quiet for a moment. Something moved through his expression that I couldn't immediately read. "Claire," he repeated, slowly, like he was holding it up to something inside his memory and checking the fit. He looked down for just a second, then back up at me. "I'm going to ask you something that might sound strange," he said. "About 2 years ago, a Thursday evening in November, were you working an overnight shift?" The room around us hadn't changed. Conversations were still going on 3 feet away. But in the immediate space where we were standing, something had gotten quieter. "I work a lot of overnight shifts," I said carefully. "I'm not sure which one you mean." He nodded. He exhaled once. "My wife," he started, and stopped himself. He pressed his lips together for a moment, collecting something before he continued. "My wife had a medical emergency at home. Late at night. I called 911. He looked at me steadily. "A dispatcher stayed on the line with me the entire time. 11 minutes. Something slowed down in my chest. She walked me through CPR," he said. His voice was measured, but there was something moving underneath it like water under ice. "She told me exactly where to place my hands. She counted with me every set, all the way through. She told me I was doing it correctly when I had no real way of knowing if that was true. And she stayed on that line until the paramedics came through the front door." He held my gaze. "The paramedics told us afterward that the quality of the CPR before they arrived made the difference between the outcome we got and the one we had been afraid of." He paused. "My wife survived." The couple who had been talking with my half-sister had gone completely still. The woman nearby had turned slightly without moving her feet. "I tried for a long time to find out who that dispatcher was," he continued. "The hospital couldn't release that information. The county records office said the same thing. I tried a few other ways and eventually stopped trying." He shook his head slightly. "But I never forgot her voice. I was aware of people at the edges of our small circle, leaning in almost imperceptibly. I've been standing across this room for the past 20 minutes, he said, and something about your voice has been doing something to my memory." He held up one hand briefly, a gesture of honest uncertainty. "I know this might seem impossible, but is there any chance that was you? There have been thousands of calls in 6 years. Most of them blur together the way days blur together when you're doing the same difficult thing day after day. But some of them don't blur. Some of them stay sharp and specific, tucked into a part of your memory that doesn't lose detail over time. A Thursday in November, 2 years ago. A man who could barely speak in full sentences when the call connected. A woman down on the living room floor. Unresponsive. Cardiac event. No warning. A responding unit that needed 11 minutes through late-night crosstown traffic. I remembered the count. I remembered his voice breaking on the sixth set and me telling him, firmly and clearly, that he was doing exactly right and to keep going. I remembered the moment the line shifted, the voices of the paramedics coming through from his end, and the particular quality of the silence that followed before I disconnected. I looked at him. Yes, I said quietly. I think that was me. He closed his eyes for just a moment. When he opened them again, they were carrying something they hadn't been carrying 30 seconds before. I knew it, he said, barely above a breath. And then, louder, to the room without meaning to address it, I knew it. The space around us had gone genuinely still. The background conversations a few feet away had faded without anyone deciding to stop them. He turned and looked slowly around the room. 2 years ago, he said, and his voice was steady and clear. My wife collapsed in our living room at 11:30 at night. Her heart stopped. By the time the ambulance arrived, she had been without a pulse for more than 8 minutes. The paramedics who came through that door were extraordinary. I am not taking a single thing away from them. He paused. But the reason there was anything for them to work with when they got there, the reason my wife had any chance at all, is because the woman on the other end of that 911 call refused to let me stop. Nobody in our part of the room moved. She counted with me, he said. 30 compressions, 2 breaths, over and over, for 11 minutes. She told me I was doing it right when I was convinced I was doing it wrong. She told me to keep going when every part of me wanted to stop because I was terrified it wasn't working. His voice caught, just briefly. She stayed on that line until I heard the paramedics come through the door. And then my wife came home from the hospital 3 weeks later. He looked at me. That was her. Someone near the back of the room drew a long, slow breath. My half-sister had not moved. Her glass was suspended halfway between the table and her mouth, and the expression on her face had traveled through several things quickly and landed somewhere I had never seen it land before. The man walked the remaining distance between us and extended his hand. Thank you, he said. And then, my wife's name is Donna. She is at home tonight because 4 grandchildren have very strong opinions about babysitters, and she lost that argument. His voice was rough around the edges now. Our daughter got married last spring. Donna danced at the reception. Our youngest grandson took his first steps last month, and she was sitting on the floor 6 feet away when he did it. He shook his head. She was there for all of it. Because of what you did on that phone call. I shook his hand. My throat was tighter than I had expected it to be. I'm so glad she's okay, I said. I mean that. I know you do, he said. That was the thing I remembered most. You weren't processing a call. You were actually present. You were with me in that room, in the way that mattered. He shook his head slightly. I have thought about those 11 minutes more times than I can count, and I have never once taken for granted what would have happened if someone different had picked up that call. Someone began clapping. I don't know who started it, but within a few seconds others had joined, and the sound moved through the room in a way that felt quiet and genuine rather than performed the way appreciation sounds when it isn't being done for an audience. My half-sister was not clapping. She was standing exactly where she had been standing, her glass now at her side, her eyes moving between me and the man and some indeterminate point in the middle distance. The man turned toward her. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a point of it the way someone might if they were trying to score something. He simply looked at her and said, very evenly, a few minutes ago you said she answers phone calls for a living. My half-sister said nothing. I want you to know, he said, that the phone calls she answered on a Thursday night in November kept my wife's heart going long enough for the paramedics to get there. That phone call is the reason Donna and I are still married. The reason my grandchildren still have their grandmother. He held her gaze without hostility, just directly. That's not answering phone calls. That's something else entirely. The silence that followed was the most complete silence I had heard all evening. My half-sister's mouth opened and then closed. The ease she had moved through the entire night with the fluency, the confidence, the particular authority of someone who has spent years being the most prepared person in any room she enters, all of it was gone. What remained was smaller and harder to look at and more honest. Behind me, I felt my mother's hand on my arm. I turned and she was looking at me with her eyes bright. "You never told me," she said softly. "You never asked," I said. I meant it gently, the way you can mean something gently when it's also simply true. She pulled me into a brief, tight hug, and I let her. The man introduced himself then. Properly. His name was David. He was a longtime friend of my half-sister's husband, which was why he had ended up in that living room on that particular night. And why the two of us had ended up in the same room for the first time in 2 years without either of us knowing it. He told me about Donna's recovery, which had been longer and more difficult than they had hoped. 6 weeks before she was allowed home. Another 3 months of cardiac rehabilitation. A medication regimen that took time to get right, and a cardiologist they trusted completely. He told me about the day she came home and the way the house felt different after weeks of being quieter than it was supposed to be. He told me she had started a vegetable garden in the backyard the following spring, because she wanted something living to take care of. He told me he had gone to a CPR certification class at the hospital 2 weeks after the emergency and practiced on the training mannequin until he could do the count in his sleep just in case he ever needed to do it again. And just because he needed to do something with what he had carried out of that night. I listened to all of it, and I let myself feel the weight of it rather than deflecting it the way I usually would. A few other guests drifted over as the evening continued. An older woman told me that her son-in-law was a paramedic and that she had believed for years that dispatchers were the ones who never got thanked. A man in a gray jacket said his mother had called 911 once, years ago, and he had never once thought about who was on the other end of that line. A woman about my age said quietly that she hadn't realized dispatching was a skill she had always assumed it was just routing. Just connecting calls. I tried to keep it in perspective, the way I always do. It's a team, I said more than once. Everything that happened that night happened because of the paramedics. I'm just the voice in the middle. David shook his head every time I said something along those lines. The voice in the middle, he said, was what held everything together long enough for the rest of it to matter. I stopped arguing after a while. I let it sit. Near the end of the evening, when guests were beginning to move toward the door and the party was settling into its final hour, my half-sister came and stood beside me near the window. The event version of herself was still on, but something behind it had shifted. She looked a little like the person I had grown up with, before she had built all the other layers on top. "I didn't know," she said. "I know you didn't," I said. "You never talk about what you do." "It's not something I bring to parties," I said. "It belongs to the people it happened to." She looked down at her glass for a moment. "What you did," she started, and then stopped. And then started again. That man was shaking when he was talking about it. 2 years later. And he was still. She stopped again. Whatever she was trying to build into a sentence wasn't coming together in the shape she needed. "It stays with people," I said. "The ones who go through it." "Does it stay with you?" she asked. I thought about that for a moment. "Some of them do," I said. "You learn which ones to let go of and which ones you're going to carry." "That one I carry." She was quiet. Then she said, simply, "I'm sorry for the way I introduced you." "I know," I said. "I mean it." "I know that too," I said. I didn't offer her forgiveness on the spot, because real things don't resolve cleanly at the end of parties, and I didn't want to offer her something easy just to make both of us more comfortable. But something between us had shifted, in the way that things shift when something true gets said in a room full of people and can't be unsaid. We both felt it. Neither of us knew yet what it would mean going forward. I said goodbye to my mother, who hugged me again and held on a beat longer than usual. I shook David's hand one more time, and he held it with both of his and said to give him a call sometime, that Donna had wanted to thank the dispatcher herself for 2 years, and now that he had found me, she was not going to let that go. I told him I would. I meant it. Outside, the string lights in the oak trees were still on, gold and warm against the dark. The expensive cars in the driveway were beginning to pull away. I sat in my own car for a few minutes without starting it, doing nothing in particular, just being still and letting the quiet settle around me. I thought about Donna at home with the grandchildren. I thought about David standing across a room for 20 minutes with someone else's voice working its way up through his memory. I thought about a Thursday in November, a headset, a monitor, and a man on the other end of a line who needed someone to hold the count with him until help arrived. Dispatching is not a job that comes with ceremonies. Nobody publishes your name. Nobody knows what building you work in, or what the inside of your console looks like, or how many calls come in on a busy night. The people you help don't see your face. Most of them don't know your name. You carry the calls home quietly because carrying them any other way would mean explaining what they cost, and not everyone has the language to understand what they cost. But sometimes a person who is on the other end of one of those calls walks across a room toward you in the middle of a party. And the thing you have been doing, quietly and without ceremony, in a building on a street most people have never driven down, becomes briefly, unexpectedly visible. I started my car and drove home through the dark neighborhoods between my half-sister's house and my own. I had a shift in the morning. I was already looking forward to it.